Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into how a radical idea about equality, born in the factories of Europe, ended up sparking one of the most world-shaking revolutions in history and completely redefined the 20th century. So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, you have to go back to the aftershocks of the French Revolution. It planted this wild idea in people's minds that you could tear down an entire society and rebuild it. This kicked off a brand new and often violent search for a more equal world. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Europe is just a hotbed of competing ideas. It's basically a massive debate about what the future should look like, with three main groups duking it out: the liberals, the radicals, and the conservatives. And these groups couldn't have been more different. You had the liberals, who wanted some reforms, but only for men with property. Then you had the conservatives, who basically wanted to pump the brakes on any major change. But the real game changers were the radicals. They were demanding a government run by the majority, and they were way ahead of their time, even supporting the right for women to vote. Now, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, which was a real double-edged sword. On one side, incredible new wealth, but on the other, for the vast majority of workers, it meant crushing poverty, brutal working hours, and just awful living conditions. For them, these political debates weren't abstract. They needed a solution, and fast. And out of all this turmoil, this new idea starts to bubble up, an idea so potent it would go on to shape the entire next century. That idea was socialism. Okay, so what is socialism, really? Well, at its core, socialists looked at the world and said, hey, you know what the root of all our problems is? Private property. Their solution was, frankly, revolutionary. Take the factories, the land, all of it, away from private owners and have society as a whole control it for the good of everyone. I mean, this was a head-on collision with capitalism. In a capitalist system, an owner builds a factory, reaps the profit. Socialists said, no, wait a minute. The workers create the value, so the wealth from that factory should be shared by everyone who works there. It's a fundamentally different way of looking at the economy. And this is where a name you've probably heard before comes into play: Karl Marx. He took this idea a step further. For Marx, this wasn't just a choice. He saw it as an inevitable clash of history. He basically predicted that workers would rise up, overthrow capitalism, and create a communist society, what he believed was the final natural endpoint for humanity. Okay, so with all these explosive ideas swirling around, let's pivot and zoom in on one place in particular: Russia. It was a massive, largely agricultural empire that was about to become the very first testing ground for these socialist theories. If you want to get a handle on what Russia was like at the dawn of the 20th century, you just need to remember this one number: a staggering 85%. That's how many people in the Russian Empire were peasants, their lives tied completely to the land. This was not an industrial society. It was something else entirely. Now, for the small fraction of people who weren't farming, life in the new industrial cities was anything but equal. By 1914, women made up about a third of the factory workforce, but they were paid terribly, sometimes as little as half of what men earned for the same work. You can just imagine the resentment building up. And as if all that economic pain wasn't enough, you've got this incredibly repressive political system layered on top of everything. Russia was an autocracy. That means one person, Tsar Nicholas II, had absolute power. There was no real parliament, no way for people to voice their grievances. It was a pressure cooker with no release valve. So you can see how all these pieces are coming together, right? It was a perfect storm. There was a failed revolution in 1905 that only led to a sham parliament. Then Russia jumped into World War I, and it was an absolute disaster. By 1917, we're talking over 7 million casualties and people starving in the cities. The entire empire was cracking at the seams. And in 1917, that pressure cooker finally blows. The system doesn't just bend, it completely shatters. And it doesn't just happen once. In one single year, Russia experiences two completely different revolutions that will forever change the course of world history. So the first one, the February Revolution, really just explodes out of nowhere. It's not planned. It starts with women textile workers going on strike, demanding bread, but it spreads like wildfire. And the real turning point? The government calls in the troops, and the soldiers, instead of firing on the crowd, actually join them. Just like that, the Tsar's power evaporates, and he's forced to give up the throne.
But the October Revolution, that was a whole different beast. The temporary government that took over was weak. It couldn't deliver peace or land. And this created an opening for the most radical group around, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. He saw his chance. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising. It was a calculated, organized coup. His followers seized key government buildings, and almost overnight, Lenin was in charge, declaring a new socialist state.
Okay, so the Bolsheviks are in charge, and they do not waste a single second. They immediately get to work, trying to build a completely new kind of world, to forge a Soviet state from the ground up. And their changes were radical and immediate. They took over all the industries and banks. They told the peasants to go out and seize the land from the nobility. They pulled Russia out of World War I, but they also created a one-party state and a secret police to crush anyone who disagreed with them. And all of this, unsurprisingly, plunged the country into a horrific and bloody civil war.
The state that rises from the ashes of that war, the Soviet Union, is going to change the entire course of the 20th century, casting this long, powerful, and incredibly complicated shadow over everything.
On the one hand, you have the promise of the revolution, right? The dream. And in some ways, they delivered. The new Soviet state built a massive school system. It provided public health care for everyone, and it set up childcare in factories so women could work. It was this vision of a modern, progressive nation that took care of its people. But on the other hand, for millions of people, especially the peasants who resisted the state taking their land, that dream was an absolute nightmare. This letter from a peasant says it all. Everything he owned, his horse, his cow, his tools, his furniture, was registered and then sold off. The promise of collective good meant a total personal loss. And here's where it gets so complicated. Because at the exact same time this is happening, people outside of Russia are looking in and seeing something totally different. For many, like this visitor from India, the Soviet Union looked like a beacon of hope, a land of true equality, where the revolution had made people fearless. And that, right there, that's the central paradox of the whole Soviet experiment. Did it turn a poor, backward country into a global superpower? Yes. Did it modernize the nation and provide for many? Yes. But, and it's a huge but, it did so through brutal repression, through forced labor, and at the cost of millions and millions of lives. So in the end, we're left with this huge, uncomfortable question. How do we even begin to judge a revolution that held out this beautiful dream of equality for so many, but created an absolute nightmare for so many others? It's the complicated and often bloody legacy of one of the most audacious social experiments in all of human history.